president's wife to join a union, especially one of those CIO communist unions, which the national, the Guild was often tarred with being communist. I venture to say it's almost equally unlikely today that the wife of the President of the United States would join a labor union, but for somewhat different reasons than when Eleanor joined. But for others trying to join a union under this national legislation, the fight was very bloody. It's hard to imagine today what it was like in 1936. And I gave a talk at Berkeley last week, and with these 20-somethings in the room trying to recreate what it was like in 1936, it's hard to do. But within days of the First Lady's announcement, Flint, Michigan became a battleground. Members of the newly formed United Automobile Workers Union shut down Fisher Body, a key General Motors plant, and the famed sit-down strikes began. While the men were barricaded in the plants, the Women's Emergency Brigade took to the streets, where the women were met by police with guns and tear gas. Many workers organizing under the New Deal legislation were intimidated, brutally beaten, and some were killed. Companies stockpiled weapons, hired paramilitary forces, and the workers fought back. It was a two-sided battle by this point. In Flint, the National Guard was called out. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins offered mediation, and the mighty John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers, flew to Detroit to negotiate. A month later, as the strikes and the violence escalated, ER, as she often signed her name, met with a group of young women in New York City, and they were out of work because of their union activities. She told her readers that, quote, many people do not believe in unions. Unquestionably, unions and their leaders are not always wise and fair, any more than any other human beings. There are only two ways to bring about protection for the workers, however: legislation and unionization. And the Wagner Act, the legislation, as the labor laws became known, embodied these combined strategies. The legislation was necessary to guarantee workers a voice at work, to take individual responsibility, and then to act collectively. To join a union and bargain for their wages and working conditions and benefits. She gave her full support, starting with her own very public union membership. Eleanor Roosevelt practiced what she preached. She was a skilled political operative, an effective government negotiator, a diplomat, inspirational public speaker, influential columnist and author, and a proud union member for over 25 years. After that day in 1936, when she joined the Newspaper Guild, she had her union card in her wallet when she died in 1962. And this is a copy of the union card that was in her wallet when she passed away.
Would you push it over here?
Hmm?
Would you flash it over here?
I would. And there are some on the back there, if you'd like to have one. The card itself was a little smaller than this, but a big argument with the press about putting it in the book, and they wouldn't put it in the book, and I said, I'll use it anyway. I will find a way to use it. But Eleanor herself wrote 27 books, over 8,000 columns. She gave over 50 speeches a year. She answered hundreds of thousands of letters every year. And she attended unending meetings. She hosted a radio program, and she had her own television show, reaching millions of people. And again, even her role as a newspaper columnist, the columnists in the 30s and 40s and 50s were our television pundits today, and they were very influential. And she was one of the leading columnists. She was also attacked by many of the other columnists. And we can talk about that if you would like. Always she was a teacher. She taught in New York City at a women's girls' high school. And she used the column and she used her speeches to explain union issues to the public and to address union audiences directly at large conventions, in small local meetings, and at labor education programs. Her My Day column was written from 1936 to 1962, 6 days a week, and provides the clearest record of her support for labor. An average of 2 columns per month specifically would mention unions or union issues. And that provides over 600 columns that form a central part of the story that I've been able to tell. And one of the fun things now is that if you go to the George Washington University webpage and go to the Eleanor Roosevelt papers, all of her newspaper columns are now online. And so you can click on April 16th, 1936, 1946, and see what she had to say that day. And a little later, I will read you a little bit of what she had to say on April 16th, 1946. Would have helped me a lot had they been available when I started this project, but we also have all 8,000 columns in a closet at our house. I've read every one of them. So, how did this woman born to wealth and privilege come to identify with the workers? She first learned about working conditions as a young debutante who just returned from England in 1904 and was charged by her headmistress in the English boarding school to give back to her community, but to understand the economic and social problems that were underlying the economic problems of the workers. So her family, the women, had always done charity work, and there were turkeys at Thanksgiving and luncheons to raise money. But Eleanor joined with a group of young elite women, and they went to work in the settlement houses. And she went to the Rivington Street Settlement House on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and taught young girls and boys to dance and sing. And she also began to work with the Consumers League to go out and investigate workplaces. And at one point, one of the children was sick. She was asked to go to the home to visit them in the tenements, and so she asked her young suitor to go with her. And Franklin Roosevelt was then at Harvard, a student at Harvard College. And he went with her, and they went into the tenements. And there is a tenement museum in New York. If you're there and have an opportunity, it's well worth going to see. 3 and 4 families crowded into 2 rooms, no windows, the smell, the noise, the outhouses were out in the back of the buildings. There was no running water. I mean, the conditions were just unbelievable, with young children making paper flowers and helping their mother with the piecework. And she reported in her first autobiography, and the first volume of it, that when they came out of that tenement house onto the streets of the Lower East Side, Franklin Roosevelt turned to her and said, "I had no idea people lived like this." And she attributes this visit to a core part of Franklin Roosevelt beginning to understand what life was like in America for many, many more people than he would ever meet in his Harvard Hyde Park
really
community.
Yes.
And I like to use it as the first example. When people say, well, did she really influence FDR? I mean, did she really have... This is one of the very first examples of Eleanor Roosevelt influencing Franklin Roosevelt. She encouraged FDR's work as a young legislator with the craft unions in Albany and when he became assistant secretary in the Navy. She had spent time with her Aunt Bai and her Uncle Theodore. And you have to remember now, when she's a young debutante, her Uncle Teddy is President of the United States. She couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote then. But her Aunt Bai was a powerful influence on Teddy Roosevelt. And she stayed with them and she learned a lot through her aunt. And interestingly, FDR followed Teddy Roosevelt's path pretty closely, although when he first ran for the legislature, which Teddy had also done, he decided to run as a Democrat instead of a Republican because his father in the Hyde Park branch of the family was a Democrat. Other than that, he ran for the legislature, he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position Teddy Roosevelt held. He became Governor of New York, a position Teddy Roosevelt held, and then he became president, much to the consternation of much of Teddy Roosevelt's family. They really didn't like the fact that FDR followed his path so carefully. But it wasn't until the 1920s when Eleanor Roosevelt became directly involved in politics herself and began to really know and understand the social unionism of the garment workers. In 1920, FDR ran for vice president with James Cox of Ohio. And Louis Howe started to work with Eleanor to get her involved in the campaign. He began to see her as someone who had ideas, who could reach out to women. And by now, women had gotten the right to vote. So organizing women to vote became very important. Cox and Roosevelt lost to Harding and Coolidge, and the Roosevelts went back to New York. And Eleanor joined a very active group of women social reformers. And it's here that she met Rose Schneiderman, who was a cap maker by trade and a fire union organizer by vocation. And Rose introduced Eleanor, and then Eleanor introduced Rose and the Women's Trade Union League to Franklin. She became very active in New York politics as well. She went and met every county Democratic chairman in the state of New York, encouraging women to use their new power to vote, although she hadn't